She only wanted to withdraw her own money, but the moment the banker saw her dark skin, everything changed. He didn't see a client, didn't see a professional, didn't see a woman who had walked through those doors dozens of times before. He saw what he chose to see, and with a smirk so slight it could almost be missed, he waved her toward the far wall with a dismissive nod, already deciding she didn't belong. What started as a routine transaction spiraled into something far uglier. Delays without explanation, questions that had nothing to do with banking, subtle humiliation stacked like bricks around her dignity. They asked her to verify and re-verify. They spoke to her like a problem. They looked at her like a threat. And then came the final blow, when the same man who treated her like a nuisance glanced up at the lobby's massive poster, saw her face staring back at him from the bank's own promotional campaign, and froze. What he thought was a nobody was actually the face of their community investment initiative. The irony nearly choked the room. But she didn't gloat. She didn't need to. The truth was louder than anything he could say. Before you watch how this story unfolds, like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Comment below with your thoughts on how you think this story will end, and tell me where you're watching from. Let's talk about injustice, identity, and the power of truth. The morning light filtered down the stone facade of the Hawthorne Fifth Bank, catching on the tall bronze logo bolted above the revolving glass doors. Inside, the floors gleamed with a high-polished shine that mirrored the rigid order of the bank's reputation. Precision, power, exclusivity. The kind of place that didn't just hold money. It held control. Odessa Graves stepped through the entrance with deliberate grace, her heels tapping softly against the marble. She wore a beige coat cinched neatly at the waist, a gray silk scarf knotted beneath her collar, and her hair pulled back into a low, neat twist. She was calm, composed, the way she had trained herself to be in places like this, where every movement could be misinterpreted and every silence weighed with suspicion. She clutched a slim leather folio under her arm. Inside were her credentials, her business documents, her identification, and the withdrawal slip she had carefully filled out the night before. She had visited this bank once before, years earlier, but it had been under different circumstances, escorted by a financial advisor, seated in a private office, treated with distant but professional courtesy. That time, she hadn't come alone. This time she had, and that made all the difference. At the main counter, she paused, scanning the tellers. Only one lane was open. The others sat vacant, lights off, despite a modest line growing behind the velvet ropes. She approached the window. Behind the glass sat a man with a kind of face that looked like it had never once experienced uncertainty. Benjamin Kessler, crisp navy suit, hair combed with calculated precision, silver tie pinned glinting under recessed lighting. His expression was unreadable at first, the kind of expression someone puts on when they're preparing to listen without ever really hearing. Odessa offered her documents with quiet clarity. Benjamin didn't reach for them. He stared at her first. A long, calculated look that started at her hair, moved to her coat, then landed on her folio. He glanced down finally, fingers tapping the keyboard with the laziness of someone in no hurry to help. The screen lit up. Her account populated instantly. The transaction details were valid. The system recognized her credentials without hesitation. But Benjamin didn't respond. He kept typing slowly, theatrically, then leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "I'm going to need to verify something," he said. Without waiting for a response, he stood and walked away through the frosted glass door behind him. Odessa stood in place. The silence behind her thickened. She could feel the glances, some idle, some sharp, all the same. The kind of glances people give when they're sure you don't belong. 5 minutes passed, then 10. No one came to update her. No one offered assistance. The other tellers never reopened. A woman in a business suit tapped her foot behind Odessa, glanced at her watch, then switched lines. Odessa adjusted her stance. Her hands remained still at her sides, but her back tensed. This wasn't unfamiliar. This was a script she'd lived too many times before. When Benjamin returned, he carried a red laminated form in one hand. His expression had sharpened. The courteous mask had dropped, replaced with something cool and hollow. He held the form between his fingers and announced, "We'll need to place this transaction on hold pending verification." Odessa blinked. She had given everything they required. She was well within the legal limit for same-day withdrawals. There had been no error, no system delay. Benjamin said, "This is just protocol for large cash disbursements when discrepancies arise." He didn't explain what the discrepancies were. He didn't have to. The implication hung in the air. He set the form on the counter, writing "under review" in thick blue ink, then slid her documents back across the glass slowly. Not in a stack. Spread out. As if to say, "These don't prove what you think they do." Odessa gathered them one by one. The red form remained. Benjamin hadn't returned it to her. It was now a part of her file. A mark. A silent accusation. She turned, still silent. But Benjamin wasn't done. As she walked away, he leaned slightly toward the clerk at the adjacent window and said something under his breath. The clerk snorted, covering it with a cough. Odessa didn't hear the words. She didn't need to. The message was always the same. The security guard standing near the front door straightened. He wasn't looking at the general area anymore. He was watching her. As Odessa approached the exit, she passed a group of executives in suits gathered near the investor kiosk. One of them shifted slightly, blocking her path for a moment too long before stepping aside without an apology. It was subtle. It always was. Outside, the sunlight struck her eyes like a flashbulb. She stepped down the stone stairs slowly, deliberately. Her face gave away nothing, but her mind roared. She had come prepared, respectful, organized. And still, her presence had been reduced to a threat. Not for what she said, not for what she did, for simply being there, asking for what she already owned. She crossed the street to the parking garage without looking back. She couldn't afford to wait. On Thursday morning, 4 days after the initial humiliation, she dressed again in neutral tones, this time in a slate gray pantsuit and low heels. She wore no jewelry. Her face was clean of makeup. She drove to the bank without music, parked in the same lot, and stepped into the same tall lobby with the same towering windows filtering light onto a floor that never remembered a single footprint. At the reception desk, the clerk asked her to wait. No greeting, no smile, no question of whether she needed assistance. Just a hand gesturing to the row of chairs lined up against the far wall beneath the mounted TV. Odessa nodded once and sat down. The chairs were leather, but stiff. Their placement felt deliberate, just far enough away from the main counter that clients seated there were clearly not yet trusted, not yet allowed inside the system. As she sat waiting, Odessa noticed that no other clients were asked to wait with her. 2 white men in sports coats stepped up to the desk, exchanged light jokes with the receptionist, and were ushered through to the teller windows within seconds. An elderly woman with a walker was helped to a private booth near the center of the lobby. Odessa remained seated. 10 minutes. 15. Then a young man in a navy vest approached. He introduced himself as Evan, a new associate, said he'd be happy to help. His voice was too bright, too rehearsed. He asked Odessa to follow him to his desk in the corner near the employee entrance, away from the glass offices and tall plants. As they walked past the teller windows, Odessa could see Benjamin Kessler at his post. He glanced up once, recognized her immediately, and turned away without acknowledgement. Evan's desk was smaller than the others. No window, no nameplate. He gestured for her to sit. She did, folding her coat over her lap. He glanced at her documents, frowned, and tapped his keyboard. The screen flickered. Odessa watched him hesitate. The frown deepened. He leaned in, clicked twice, and then sat back slowly. His smile faded just slightly, though he kept in place. "According to your profile," he began, "it looks like there was a hold placed on your last transaction." "Yes," Odessa said evenly, "there was, and I was never informed why." Evan scratched the back of his neck and said he'd have to speak to a supervisor. He stood, left. Odessa sat alone at his desk for 7 minutes. A printer across the room groaned to life. Phones rang. Clients came and went. No one offered her water. No one made eye contact. When Evan returned, he looked less certain. He said a supervisor wasn't currently available. But if Odessa was willing to fill out a new verification form and resubmit her withdrawal request, he could try again. He didn't say he would try hard, or that he believed the request was valid, just that he would try. Odessa filled it out. Her handwriting, always neat, looked tighter than usual. When she passed the form back, Evan nodded and stood. He returned 2 minutes later with a different tone. "It's still under review," he said, "but I've been told we'll contact you when it's approved." He smiled again, more forced this time. He offered to walk her out. She declined. As Odessa passed the lobby windows, she caught sight of Benjamin again. He was laughing with another teller. A joke passed between them. One of them glanced her way. The other stifled a smile. She kept walking. As she stepped outside, Odessa's phone buzzed. A message from her assistant, checking on whether the funds had arrived. Odessa typed a reply, paused, and deleted it. She'd give it one more try tomorrow. But as she stood in the crosswalk waiting for the light to change, a familiar feeling crept through her chest. Not fear, not defeat, but the pressure of long-suppressed rage pressing just beneath the surface. This time, Odessa chose to dress differently, not more formally. There was nothing wrong with how she presented herself before, but deliberately plain. A simple black sweater, pressed gray slacks, and flat shoes. No jewelry. Her hair tied back. The sort of outfit no one could mistake as provocative, showy, or outside corporate norms. If their treatment shifted, she'd know why. The bank was quieter this time. Only a few clients waited at the teller windows, and yet no one invited her forward when she stepped inside. She stood near the reception desk and waited. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with a voice that never rose above a whisper, acknowledged her with a nod and asked her to take a seat. Odessa complied, choosing a chair at the far end of the lobby. She sat still, her documents clutched in one hand, her purse folded neatly in her lap. She watched as two women in pencil skirts walked up to the desk and were helped immediately. She waited. 15 minutes passed. A janitor emerged from the side hallway pushing a maintenance cart. As he passed Odessa, he paused, glanced at her for a moment, then placed a bright yellow, wet floor sign beside her chair, though the tiles were dry. She said nothing. Another 10 minutes. Then a teller, young, unsure, but trying to project authority, approached and asked Odessa to step aside for an identity clarification. His voice was careful, almost rehearsed. Odessa followed him down a narrow hallway past the teller stations and into a small side room used for customer verifications. The room was brightly lit and windowless, with 2 plastic chairs and a metal desk. He asked her to remove her scarf. She did. He asked if she had another photo ID. She provided a passport. He examined it closely, holding it up to the fluorescent light, turning it left and right as if expecting it to dissolve in his hands. When she offered to show her work badge as additional proof, he declined. "We'll see what we can do with this," he said, standing and walking out with her documents. Odessa remained seated. The room smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and dust. 10 more minutes. Then the teller returned, not with her documents, but with a box of disposable gloves and a packet of sanitation wipes. He handed them to her without explanation. Odessa stared at them for a moment before asking what they were for. He said the bank had implemented new hygiene protocols. For safety, not for her specifically, just a precaution. When she pressed him on whether all clients were required to wipe their hands before transactions, he deflected. "It's best practice," he said. Odessa sat still. Her face was calm. Her hands did not move. Eventually, he collected the gloves and wipes and excused himself again. Another 10 minutes. When he returned this time, he held her documents differently, not in the usual banker's folder, but in a manila envelope, unsealed, crumpled slightly at the corner. He handed them to her and said, "I'm afraid the transaction is still pending review." His voice was lower now, less certain. Odessa asked who was conducting the review. He didn't answer directly. "There's a new internal step," he said. "A policy we're adapting for certain cases." Odessa knew the word he wasn't saying. Certain. She thanked him and stood. As she made her way back to the lobby, she noticed that someone had placed an air freshener spray canister on the reception desk. It hadn't been there before. It was turned so the label faced out, citrus burst. One of the tellers sprayed a quick burst into the air as she walked by, smiling at nothing in particular. Odessa said nothing. She exited the building slowly, pausing near the revolving doors. As she glanced back, she caught Benjamin Kessler at his station again. This time, he didn't look away. He met her eyes directly, then offered a slow, deliberate smile before turning back to his screen. Outside, the wind had picked up. The air carried the scent of car exhaust and freshly watered concrete. Odessa walked to her car in silence. She sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. Her hands were cold. Her thoughts burned. She had been treated as if she carried something contagious. Her identity questioned. Her appearance reduced to an inconvenience. Each visit to the bank became a new act in a carefully orchestrated play of marginalization. And yet none of it would be documented. No record would show that a woman was made to wait longer, that she was given wipes, that someone sprayed the air after she passed. There would be no emails, no logs, just policy shifts, staff discretion, safety protocols. It was racism made sterile, sanitized, safe for corporate culture. It didn't shout, it whispered. And it whispered over and over again until even strong hands began to tremble. Odessa wasn't trembling, but she was tired. And for the first time, as she stared out through the windshield at the towering bank building, she realized that what she was up against wasn't one man. It was a machine, a structure, one that didn't need to say her name aloud to decide she didn't belong. She drove away slowly, her tires humming across the asphalt, her documents still in her lap, untouched. Tomorrow, she would come again. But today, the message had been clear. Dress plainly, speak softly, sit where told, and still be treated like a contaminant in a system that refused to see her humanity. They had shown they were not reacting to what she wore. They were reacting to what she was. As she entered, the air was noticeably cooler than usual, sharp against her face, as if the building had exhaled something sterile and unfriendly just for her. She approached the front desk. The receptionist, a new woman this time, greeted her with a polite nod and immediately asked for her name. Odessa provided it clearly and without hesitation. The woman typed, squinted at the screen, then frowned slightly. "It looks like there's a note on your profile," she said. "Please wait one moment." Odessa was directed not to the leather chairs this time, but to a small room off the side of the lobby, one she hadn't been in before. It had no windows, no decorations, just a rectangular table and two plastic chairs under a humming fluorescent light. She was left there without explanation. The door remained open, but no one passed. She waited for nearly 20 minutes before a man entered, not a teller or a clerk, but someone in a blazer and thin-rimmed glasses who introduced himself as a senior compliance officer. His demeanor was polite but distant, every word carefully chosen. He sat across from her and smiled as if they were old colleagues meeting over coffee. "Ms. Graves," he began, "we've been reviewing some discrepancies in your account history." Odessa, puzzled but steady, asked what discrepancies he referred to. He waved his hand gently, as if the specifics weren't important. "Just some irregularities in behavior patterns," he said. "Routine checks, system audits." Odessa narrowed her eyes and asked directly whether her transaction had triggered a flag, and if so, on what grounds. He didn't answer with facts. Instead, he asked her if she had traveled recently. Had she changed phones? Had she given anyone else access to her account? When she replied no to each, he nodded slowly, thoughtfully, as if trying to solve a puzzle. Then he leaned back and asked whether she'd ever felt unsure about the security of her own financial behavior. It was phrased as concern, but Odessa understood the real question. Did she even understand how banks worked? Had she mismanaged something without realizing? Did she perhaps, unknowingly, become her own liability? Her spine straightened, and her voice remained calm. "I know exactly how I manage my finances," she said. The man smiled again, wrote something in his notepad, and then casually mentioned that a temporary profile lock had been placed on her account until further notice. He offered no justification, no policy document, no time frame. Odessa asked to speak to someone from Risk Operations. He said that would require a formal request and could take up to 30 days. She asked to speak to the branch manager. He said the manager was in a quarterly compliance summit and unavailable for direct meetings. Odessa folded her hands in her lap, every muscle in her body focused on not showing anger. She knew what this was. Not incompetence, not confusion. It was calculated erasure. He stood and thanked her for her patience. As he turned to leave, Odessa asked for a printed copy of whatever document outlined the decision to restrict her access. He paused, then said, "Unfortunately, those internal reviews are confidential." She sat in the chair for 5 more minutes after he left, not because she was waiting for anyone, but because she needed to understand exactly what they had done. They had taken her certainty and replaced it with doubt. They had surrounded her with process and left no person to blame. It was designed that way. When she returned to the lobby, the receptionist pretended not to see her. The chairs were full now, mostly with elderly clients filling out forms, and no one made room for her. She stood near the wall, unnoticed, unimportant. She left quietly. In her car, Odessa stared at her own reflection in the rearview mirror. Not angry, not sad, empty. They hadn't said she couldn't have her money. They hadn't closed her account. They hadn't denied her service. Instead, they asked questions meant to imply instability. They created doubt where none existed. They made her feel she was wrong for asking to access what was hers. That was the cruelty of it. They didn't want to stop her outright. They wanted her to feel uncertain enough to stop herself. The word that lingered in her mind was one the man had never said out loud: volatile. The woman behind the desk, a younger employee Odessa had not seen before, clicked her keyboard rapidly and narrowed her eyes at the screen. The pause that followed was different this time. Not one of confusion, but of realization. The receptionist asked Odessa to wait a moment, then disappeared through a side hallway, leaving the counter unmanned. Odessa remained standing, aware of the glances she drew from the line forming behind her. She stood straight, document folder in hand, eyes forward. Minutes later, a man emerged wearing a dark vest with the bank's logo stitched in silver across the chest. He introduced himself as Russell from Customer Integrity Services and said he would be handling her case today. She had never heard of that department. He gestured not to an office, but to a low table near the security station, public, small, placed just beside the velvet queue lines. She sat slowly, aware of how exposed she was now, how visible. Russell opened a file folder, flipping through printed sheets, and said her case had been escalated due to potential account misuse. Odessa asked him to clarify. He responded by asking if she'd ever provided her account information to anyone outside her organization. She said no. He nodded, then asked if she had ever been involved in any civil disputes related to money. Again, no. He marked her response on a form. His tone remained neutral, but his questions were not. They were calculated to provoke shame without accusation, as if waiting for her to admit something that didn't exist. He produced a printout of several transactions from the past 6 months, donations to nonprofit groups, vendor payments for health outreach events, and a recent invoice to a city clinic. He pointed to the amounts. "Were these authorized by you?" Odessa looked at him, stone-faced, and said of course they were. Then he asked if she had receipts. She responded that as a private individual making personal and business-aligned contributions from a personal account, she wasn't legally required to provide them. Still, he continued. He made a note. Then he asked if she had ever experienced memory issues. The question came out quiet, almost casual, as if it had slipped into the conversation by accident. Odessa said nothing at first. Then, evenly, she asked what relevance that question had to her withdrawal. He simply said it was standard, a routine evaluation step, a protocol for protecting both the institution and its clients. She stared at him long enough that he looked down. Then he offered her a brochure, thin, glossy, with photos of smiling people, and said she might want to consider speaking with one of the bank's financial health counselors. It was offered as a kindness, a gesture, but Odessa knew exactly what it was: a redirection, a smear, a polite suggestion that perhaps she was overwhelmed, perhaps she was not competent enough to manage large transactions without guidance. And while no record would ever label her as such, the notes Russell scribbled on that form would follow her internally, shaping how the system treated her without ever saying why. When she refused the brochure, he thanked her for her time and said the matter would be forwarded to internal risk evaluation. He didn't say when she could expect access again. He didn't offer to follow up. He stood and walked away. Odessa remained seated at the low table, surrounded by strangers watching her with uncertain eyes, as if unsure whether they were looking at someone important or someone dangerous. When she finally rose to leave, the security guard by the door nodded at her, but did not speak. Outside, the sky was pale and clouded, a soft wind lifting the edge of her coat. She walked to her car slowly, her mind no longer buzzing with questions, but locked in cold clarity. They were not just delaying her, they were rewriting her. Not in public, not in ways anyone would notice, but inside the system. They were turning her from a client into a liability, by subtle movements that signaled she had been discussed behind closed doors. When she walked through the entrance, she did not head directly to the teller windows. Instead, she made her way to the service desk. A different receptionist sat there now, a young woman with heavily lacquered nails and a too bright smile. Odessa introduced herself, stated her intent clearly, and was met with a familiar pause. The woman's eyes flicked toward her monitor, then up to Odessa, then toward a door behind her that led to the offices. A few seconds passed before she stood and asked Odessa to wait. Without giving a reason, she disappeared into the back. While Odessa waited, two clients walked in and were immediately waved through to the tellers. No waiting. No questions, just smooth, seamless service. A third client, an older man in khakis and a golf jacket, approached the desk, looked at Odessa, then looked away, not acknowledging her presence. When the receptionist returned, she no longer looked quite as cheerful. She informed Odessa that someone from risk operations would be with her shortly and asked her to step aside. Odessa did as instructed, moving toward the far wall of the lobby, where two wooden chairs sat beneath a decorative art installation meant to suggest prosperity. It featured sculpted leaves in shades of bronze and silver, branching upward in perfect symmetry, untouched by human hands. 20 minutes passed before a tall man in a dark gray suit approached. He was unfamiliar to Odessa, but wore the unmistakable expression of someone who had read her file. He introduced himself as Martin Delaney from Compliance Communications and gestured toward the hallway. Instead of leading her to a private office or a consultation room, he brought her to a narrow corridor where internal staff typically passed between departments. There, beside a set of printer cabinets and a water cooler, he began to speak. He said her name had come up in several internal reviews. He said certain employees had expressed concern over her behavior. Terms like abrupt, confrontational, non-compliant had been informally logged in anecdotal reports. Odessa blinked slowly, understanding immediately what he was saying. There was no formal write-up, no specific incident, just vague impressions, passed from one staff member to another like whispers. She asked if she could see these reports. He said they were verbal summaries, not official documents. Odessa asked who had filed them. He said confidentiality prohibited disclosure. She asked what specifically she had done to be labeled non-compliant. He offered only a careful response. The way you've interacted with our staff has created discomfort. Discomfort. The word hung in the air like smoke. Not a rule broken, not a threat made, just discomfort. Odessa asked if discomfort was now grounds for denying financial services. He shifted, smiled, and said it wasn't about denial, it was about ensuring a respectful environment for everyone. Odessa, for the first time, felt the muscles in her jaw clench. She asked him directly if her race had anything to do with how she was being treated. He didn't answer. Instead, he said the institution served all communities with fairness and integrity, and that any implication otherwise would be taken seriously. The implication, he said, not the act. The conversation ended shortly after. She was told her withdrawal remained under review. He thanked her for her understanding and walked away without waiting for her acknowledgement. Odessa remained in that narrow hallway for several moments before walking back through the lobby. As she passed the central customer seating area, she noticed the tellers whispering to each other, glancing in her direction with eyes that no longer held uncertainty, but something more rooted, something judgmental. One of them said something to another behind a cupped hand. Another smiled tightly and looked away. She could feel it, the shift. The story they had spun internally was no longer about delayed documentation or verification. It had become about her tone, her body language, her presence. She had become an internal cautionary tale. When she reached the exit, she paused. A flyer caught her eye on the community bulletin board near the door. It was titled Financial Respect and Safety Guidelines. On the list were several bullet points: respect staff authority, avoid hostile language, maintain physical boundaries. The words were neutral, but their placement, their timing, their visibility said something else entirely. They had placed it there for her, not with her name on it, but with her in mind. She left the building in silence, her face expressionless, her hand still. The air outside was warm, but her skin felt cold. She had not raised her voice. She had followed every instruction. And still, her character was being dissected and reassembled behind her back by people who had never spoken to her for more than 3 minutes at a time. That was the new tactic: slander without evidence, ostracization through implication. They didn't need proof. They only needed repetition, whispered accounts, shared glances, phrases passed between cubicles. In this system, enough whispers became truth. And the more she returned, the more the myth grew. She was now the difficult client. When Odessa Graves returned to Hawthorne Fifth Bank the following week, she did not step into the building with the composure that once defined her presence. The woman who had endured 6 humiliating visits, each one darker and more isolating than the last, no longer walked with quiet strength. She moved with visible wear. Her posture remained upright, but the fire behind her eyes had dimmed. The tension in her jaw held not defiance now, but restraint. The campaign against her, silent and coordinated, had chipped away at her identity piece by piece. They had rewritten her reputation without needing facts, had recast her dignity as hostility, her clarity as confrontation, her questions as accusations. Each visit was like entering a theater where she had already been cast in the role of problem, and no matter how still, how polite, how restrained she acted, the plot continued without her consent. She stepped into the bank lobby and felt it immediately, an invisible shift in the air, the silence that clung too tightly to her skin, the hushed tension from staff pretending not to notice her arrival. The receptionist today didn't ask her name. She simply gestured toward a hallway to the left of the main floor. No one offered her a greeting. No one asked how they could assist. Her presence alone was treated as a disruption to be managed. Odessa followed the hallway until she was met by another unfamiliar face, a woman in her late 50s wearing a tan blazer and a laminated badge with no title beneath her name. The woman introduced herself as Marla and asked Odessa to follow her into a back room that felt more like a waiting cell than an office. The room had 4 walls painted dull gray, a single square table, and no windows. On the table was a stack of blank paper, a sealed envelope, and a bottle of hand sanitizer. Odessa sat without being asked. Marla did not offer a seat across from her, but instead stood by the door, flipping through a folder while delivering a monologue in a controlled, almost mechanical tone. She informed Odessa that her continued visits had triggered an operational risk review. She explained that further interactions would be conducted by limited staff and only under direct supervision. She said this was a precautionary decision based on an accumulation of behavior-related concerns. When Odessa asked what specific behaviors were under review, Marla said only that repeated resistance to policy, failure to comply with discretionary advice, and patterns of emotional volatility had been observed. Odessa felt something inside her shift, not rage, not panic, but something quieter and far more dangerous. A cracking, a shattering of the internal scaffolding she had built to carry herself through this storm with dignity. She stared at Marla and asked if she was being accused of anything criminal. Marla shook her head. Odessa asked if her account had been compromised. Marla said no. Odessa asked if she was being banned from the premises. Again, the answer was no. Then what exactly had she done? Odessa asked, this time her voice not loud, but stripped bare of civility. Marla did not respond. Instead, she handed Odessa the sealed envelope and said it contained a final summary of the bank's position. She recommended Odessa review it with legal counsel. Odessa placed the envelope on the table without opening it. She sat still, her eyes staring at the opposite wall as if trying to find an anchor in the pattern of the paint. The silence that stretched between them was brittle. When Marla finally stepped out, Odessa remained alone. 10 minutes passed, then 15. No one returned. No explanation followed. She was not told to leave. She was not given a reason to stay. She was simply abandoned in a gray room under the full weight of institutional cruelty, disguised as professional policy. When she finally rose and walked out, no one acknowledged her. Not the receptionist, not the teller, not the manager who glanced toward her, then turned away mid-step. She was a phantom now, no longer a client, not yet a liability, something undefined and therefore unworthy of presence. She exited the building not with anger, not even with pain. She felt nothing. That frightened her more than anything. The world outside remained bright, but her vision had narrowed. The weight in her chest had turned inward. The system hadn't just denied her money. It had denied her reality. The same system that had accepted her deposits, praised her community partnerships, and once invited her to their annual funders' dinner had now erased that entire history. She was no longer someone worth serving. She was someone to be processed. A disruption, a profile, a cautionary tale. She returned to her car, but did not drive home. Instead, she sat behind the wheel, envelope unopened in her hand, and let herself feel the weight of the degradation she had endured. She thought about the years of effort it took to build her career, the silent battles fought in boardrooms, the long hours spent advocating for people in neighborhoods no banker ever visited, the young women who saw her as proof they could belong in spaces like this. And now, she wondered what they would see if they watched her now. Not the visionary, not the donor, not the founder. They would see a black woman being quietly dismantled in a glass tower with polite smiles and carefully worded policies. She opened the envelope finally. Inside was a single-page document written in neutral language. It said her transaction had been permanently deferred pending enhanced account verification, subject to undefined compliance review procedures. There was no explanation of how to fulfill these procedures. No timeline, no appeal process, just a new wall dressed as protocol. She folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, then placed it on the passenger seat beside her. She sat still for another hour, watching people enter and exit the building. Some laughing, some speaking casually, some greeted by name. She watched the door close behind them and realized the truth. She had never belonged here. They had only accepted her money. They had never accepted her. The account had her name, but not her voice. The system had smiled at her success while quietly preparing to discredit it. That understanding, once clear, could not be unlearned. She started the car slowly. The sound of the engine startled her. Her hands trembled, not with fear, not even with grief, with exhaustion. Exhaustion born not from a single act of racism, but from the unrelenting accumulation of cruelty too strategic to be named, too polite to be called out, too ordinary to be believed by anyone who had never lived it. She drove forward with no destination. The road stretched ahead of her, and for the first time, she considered that maybe her fight was never against one bank, one policy, or one man in a navy suit. Her fight was against the shape of injustice itself, The one that wore a tie, spoke in professional cadence, and still managed to crush dignity without leaving fingerprints. 2 days after Odessa Graves sat in her car outside Hawthorne Fifth Bank, exhausted and erased, she awoke before dawn in her quiet apartment, surrounded by silence, so profound it pressed against her skin. The envelope from the bank still sat on her desk, unopened a second time. The document inside burned into her memory, not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. It didn't say she was denied. It didn't say she was disqualified. It didn't say she was wrong. Instead, it buried her beneath procedures with no pathway forward, locked her out with bureaucracy, not bars. But that morning, something shifted in Odessa. Not a burst of anger, not a sudden clarity, but the quiet click of everything snapping into place. The bank had rewritten her story without ever asking for the truth. And now she would give it to them. That morning, she dressed with purpose. A navy blue pantsuit pressed and crisp, a silver watch gifted by her late mother wrapped around her wrist, and a thin folder tucked beneath her arm containing not forms or requests, but proof. Not just of her identity, but of her power. She walked into the Hawthorne Fifth Bank for the last time not as a client, not as a woman seeking assistance, but as a storm they didn't see coming. The receptionist didn't recognize her immediately. Odessa gave her name calmly and requested to speak with the branch manager. When the woman asked if she had an appointment, Odessa simply said no, but that the manager would want to make time. There was something in her tone that made the receptionist pause, then nod and disappear down the hallway. Odessa waited near the center of the lobby, not tucked away in the corner, not seated in the periphery. She stood where everyone could see her. After several minutes, a man in a gray three-piece suit approached, Robert Varnell, the branch's senior operations director, one of the highest-ranking officials in the regional system. His expression was curious but careful, clearly unsure of how to interpret her presence. He invited her into his office. She followed. The office was spacious, lined with dark wood paneling, tall windows, and 2 leather chairs arranged before a massive oak desk. Varnell offered a seat. Odessa remained standing. Before he could speak, she opened her folder and placed a set of glossy presentation pages on his desk. On the top sheet, bold lettering spelled out a name he had seen before, but never connected to the woman now standing in front of him. Odessa Graves, founder and executive director of Pillar East Initiative, the largest nonprofit health equity organization in the region, responsible for over $12 million in annual community investment, a partner of 5 state departments, a federal grant recipient, and an advisory board member to multiple municipal finance institutions. She turned the page. It showed press releases, testimonials, endorsements from senators, contracts with clinics, documentation of funding funneled through Hawthorne Fifth Bank's own community lending program, initiated in part by Odessa's team. Varnell froze. He read her name again, then her face, then back to the page. Odessa spoke without emotion. For the past 3 weeks, I have been denied access to my own funds, subjected to discriminatory treatment, targeted through policy manipulation, and publicly degraded under the false narrative of internal security protocol. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her presence did the speaking. She placed another page on the desk. This one showed photos. One was of the bank's annual equity summit, held 6 months prior. In the image, Varnell stood smiling on a stage. Behind him, a banner read, featuring keynote speaker Odessa Graves. Another showed a billboard from 2 months ago featuring Odessa's image promoting the bank's community investment campaign. The final photo was a screenshot of a testimonial posted on the bank's website under the heading, "Our Partners in Progress." Beneath the title, her name again, her story, her quote. Varnell's throat moved as he swallowed. Odessa didn't blink. "You knew who I was," she said. "You used my name, my face, my partnerships when it served your image. And when I walked through your doors without a title, without a sponsor, you stripped me down to nothing and told your staff to call it policy." She stepped closer. "I did not forget who I was. You did. And now I am here to remind you." Varnell stood, his mouth opening slightly, a defensive explanation forming. But before he could speak, she raised her hand and placed one last document on the table. A formal complaint filed with the state's Division of Financial Institutions. It named the bank, the branch, several employees, and referenced attached affidavits from community partners and staff who had witnessed the pattern of discrimination. Odessa then sat down for the first time across from him. Calm, centered, knowing the shift had begun, Varnell asked if she wanted to resolve the matter internally. Odessa smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "That's no longer possible," she said. "This is beyond correction. This is exposure. You used my success to sell inclusion, and then tried to erase me the moment I asked to be treated like any other client." She stood and walked to the door. As she opened it, she turned one last time. "Justice," she said, "doesn't begin when the law is broken. It begins when the truth is no longer afraid to speak." Then she stepped into the lobby. The receptionist stared, now fully aware of who she was. Several staff members froze as she passed. One of the junior tellers, who had once laughed with Benjamin Kessler, dropped her pen. No one spoke. No one smiled. But every eye followed her, not with pity or suspicion, but with sudden, sharp recognition. Outside, the sky had turned overcast. A soft wind moved the air like breath, and the street, once indifferent, now seemed to make room for her steps. She walked away from the building not triumphant, not vengeful, but returned to herself, whole, seen, and no longer waiting for permission. No longer a faceless transaction, no longer a patient inconvenience. They had learned the weight of her identity in a single afternoon, and the fallout began swiftly. At the downtown headquarters, executive teams huddled behind glass conference walls, whispering details of the formal investigation now launched by the Office of Financial Oversight. The complaint, thoroughly constructed and submitted with extensive supporting evidence, detailed not only the discrimination Odessa had endured, but the institutional rot that allowed it to go unchecked. Policies that disguised bias as process. Staff training protocols that allowed discretion without accountability. Client profiles that flagged compliance issues based on untracked verbal reports. The system had not just failed her, it had functioned exactly as designed. And now, under a blinding white light of scrutiny, that design was being dissected. At the local branch, Benjamin Kessler arrived precisely at 8:30, tie tight, shoes polished, unaware that his access badge had already been flagged. When he tapped it against the side entrance reader, the door refused to budge. A second attempt yielded the same result. His confusion deepened until the security guard, the same one who had once watched Odessa without question, now approached and calmly informed Benjamin that he had been placed on administrative hold pending investigation. Kessler's protest sputtered as another manager, pale and tight-lipped, escorted him back to his car without explanation. He wasn't alone. By mid-morning, 3 other staff members had been pulled from a floor, not in silence, but in full view of the clients they once served with contempt masked as courtesy. Odessa's name had become unspoken currency. Every teller, every associate, every compliance officer now knew who she was, not because of a scandal, but because her truth had forced the institution to look at itself. She had done what policy had failed to do. She had shifted the axis of accountability. And outside the bank's doors, the pressure was mounting. Civil rights attorneys reached out to her office. Advocacy organizations that once celebrated her quietly now asked to amplify her story publicly. Journalists contacted her press team for interviews. Her refusal to be erased had become a lighthouse for every client who had ever been shamed into silence by the illusion of neutral procedure. Within 48 hours, Hawthorne Fifth Bank issued a formal statement acknowledging that a client of significant public standing had raised concerns warranting an independent third-party audit. The language was careful. They didn't name her. They didn't admit wrongdoing. But they named the audit, and that was admission enough. Inside the branch, posters featuring Odessa's face, once proudly mounted for their community campaign, had been quietly removed in the weeks following her initial visit. Now, under order from corporate, they were restored. Not out of reverence, but necessity. Her face was part of their promise, and the absence of it had become an indictment. But the most telling shift occurred not behind closed doors or internal emails, but in the quiet behavior of staff who remained. Where once Odessa had been treated as invisible or problematic, her presence now hung over every interaction like an unseen sentinel. Tellers asked fewer questions. Clients of color were now greeted with heightened courtesy. Training modules were revised overnight. Words like discretion and risk protocol were suddenly evaluated through the lens of bias. Odessa had not demanded retribution. She hadn't sought revenge. She hadn't yelled or threatened. She had simply insisted on being seen. And the force of her truth had pulled the mask off an entire operation. Meanwhile, Benjamin Kessler sat in a private office downtown, not at a desk, but across from an attorney hired by the bank to assess his role in the allegations. He was asked to explain every interaction he'd had with Odessa, every note logged, every comment made, every moment of laughter shared with another teller after she walked away. What had once been routine was now forensic. He tried to defend himself with vague memories and references to standard operating procedure, but his words landed flat. For the first time, Benjamin realized that the safety net he'd always assumed, his authority, his uniform, his voice, had holes. That the institution which once protected him would now offer him up if it meant saving itself. In a single week, Odessa's name had gone from erased to etched. Her complaint had not just forced change, it had become the catalyst for a reckoning. Weeks passed. The public investigation sparked by Odessa Graves' formal complaint continued behind closed conference doors, drawing legal observers, consultants, and regulatory officers into the once impenetrable operations of Hawthorne Fifth Bank. Within the institution, staff who had once moved with careless ease now treaded carefully, uncertain which behavior, once routine, would be deemed unacceptable by the standards they had never thought applied to them. But for Odessa, the outcome had already moved beyond personal vindication. It had evolved into something deeper, something more expansive than justice. It had become purpose. She hadn't planned to stay involved. Her initial goal had been clarity, exposure, the return of dignity stolen piece by a system designed to choke the voice of the undesired. But when the board's diversity liaison followed up on their formal letter with a phone call and a quiet offer for her to join their equity reform task force, Odessa did not reject them outright. She requested time. And in that time, she didn't disappear. She walked into community centers, health clinics, and auditoriums packed with young professionals who had watched the media storm unfold with wide eyes and silent admiration. They hadn't seen every detail, but they understood what she'd done. She had not broken their walls with rage. She had bent the weight of their silence with endurance. Her story circulated in speeches, workshops, interviews, and publications. But she didn't chase headlines. She focused instead on the structure, the foundation of what allowed harm to thrive unchallenged. When she finally accepted the bank's invitation, it was on her terms. She did not ask for ceremony. She asked for accountability. She asked for the right to speak directly to the employees at the branch where it had all begun, not behind a podium, but in the room where she had once sat for 40 minutes without water, without explanation, without dignity. They agreed. That morning, the employees of Hawthorne Fifth Bank's East Branch gathered in the multipurpose conference room. It was the same room where they'd once reviewed quarterly earnings, compliance updates, and new product launches. This time, they sat in quiet rows, facing the woman who had become their reckoning. Odessa stood before them, not in designer clothes or branding regalia, but in the same slate gray suit she had worn on her second visit, neat, plain, and exact. She began not with accusation, but with memory. She told them what it felt like to be passed over, rerouted, mislabeled, and rewritten. She explained how racism within institutions rarely roars, but often whispers until its noise drowns truth entirely. She reminded them that power was not in position or policy, but in behavior, in presence, in choice. Then she paused and asked a question. What story would each of them want told about their role when no one was watching? No one answered aloud, but the silence was heavier than shame. In the audience sat Benjamin Kessler, now reinstated but demoted. given a warning, and placed under mandatory supervision and equity retraining. The arrogance that once shaped his posture had drained from his shoulders. He watched Odessa not with defiance, not with bitterness, but with an expression weighted in reflection. When her talk ended, Odessa did not ask for thanks. She gathered her notes and turned to leave, but Kessler stood slowly and took a step forward. Without a prompt, he spoke. He said her name clearly. He admitted that he had failed her, not only in action, but in principle. That he had let assumption guide his judgment, that he had been part of something bigger than himself, and only now did he understand its cost. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He offered ownership. Odessa met his eyes and nodded once. Nothing more was needed. From that day, the bank initiated a multi-year inclusion review, not a temporary initiative for public relations, but a formal partnership with outside agencies and internal restructuring. Policies changed. Training evolved. Promotions were reviewed not only by performance metrics, but by character assessments, team feedback, and community reputation. Within 6 months, Odessa's role expanded from advisory partner to strategic consultant across multiple branches. Her insights informed new guidelines for handling customer complaints, staff conduct, and systemic pattern tracking. The woman once accused of volatility now shaped the institution's definition of professionalism. But the most significant change didn't happen in boardrooms or memos. It happened when a woman named Shanice, a single mother with 2 jobs and no time to wait in lobbies, walked to the East Branch with a financial question. She was met with immediate assistance, patient clarity, and respect. She walked out not just served, but seen. Months later, a college graduate named Lamar opened his first business account. The banker handling his documents asked about his goals, his plans, his story. And when Lamar later asked what inspired the bank's shift in approach, the banker pointed toward a framed photo near the reception desk. It wasn't promotional. It wasn't staged. It was a candid shot taken at a community event of Odessa Graves sitting among local residents, listening. Above it, a plaque read, "Respect begins when silence ends." Odessa never saw the plaque herself. She didn't need to. She didn't return to that branch often, not because she avoided it, but because it no longer defined the extent of her impact. Her work had expanded far beyond those walls. Her presence was now echoed in policies, in training modules, in staff language, in community trust. She continued to lead Pillar East Initiative, continued to walk into spaces once closed to women like her, and leave the doors open for others. Redemption, she realized, was not about turning villains into saints. It was about forcing institutions to look in the mirror long enough to change. And real change did not begin with punishment. It began with awareness, with humility, with the uncomfortable work of learning how to see the people who had been invisible for far too long. Years later, when asked what sustained her through that experience, Odessa never spoke of anger. She spoke of clarity, of the need to speak even when the room seems built to drown your voice, of the strength in refusing to let someone else narrate your worth. And most of all, she spoke of justice, not as a courtroom result or a press release, but as a choice, a decision to confront harm, to demand truth, and to build a future where the next woman who walks through the door is met not with suspicion, but with welcome. And in that future, the story they would tell about Odessa Graves would not begin in humiliation. It would begin in power. The end. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter in Odessa's journey and other stories that reveal hidden truths and powerful transformations. What did you think of the plot twist and the direction the story took? Which part hit you the hardest? Let me know your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear how this story resonates with people in different parts of the world.